The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, author Annelise Orleck takes us inside the global uprising against poverty wages. Dan Maurer of the Communications Workers of America outlines a progressive agenda for renegotiating NAFTA. Plus, Bill Press with Rebecca Leber of Mother Jones on the legacy of Scott Pruitt. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Annelise Orleck is a longtime historian of labor movements. Her newest book tracks the growing fight across the globe for workers' rights and a living wage. And we say hello to Annelise Orleck, who's a professor of history at Dartmouth College and the author most recently of We Are All Fast Food Workers Now, the Global Uprising Against Poverty Wages. Annelise Orleck, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thank you for having me.
Well, our pleasure to have you with us. Your book is a remarkable account of low-wage workers across the globe. How did you do your research?
I did my research in all kinds of ways. Interestingly, one of the ways that I found people was the same way that this new movement has found each other, and that is social media. I began to look for references about strikes and uprisings and new kinds of protests as part of this rising global labor movement. And I Facebooked people, I texted them, I Twittered and reached out all of those ways. And in so doing was able to make contact with people from South Africa to Baja California to Providence, Rhode Island. After that, we traveled around the world. I traveled with photographer Elizabeth Cook, who did original photographs for this project, and we did interviews in union halls. We did them in the midst of protests in the streets. We did them in faded old colonial hotels. We interviewed people by phone, by Skype, in person, and in many, many languages. And we traveled on planes and buses, but also in open-air tuk-tuks in Asia on the backs of motorcycles. It was a pretty adventurous research process.
Wow. That actually sounds like a lot of fun on top of everything else, just to have that type of experience. And across this expansive stretch of experience, what kind of similarities did you see in the way that low-income work affects people's lives?
Well, one thing that became clear is that there have been some larger changes that have happened as a result of neoliberal capitalism in the last 30, 40 years. So here are the issues. Everywhere I went, people were protesting what they called contractualization, or what we call the gig economy. And what that means is that nobody's an employee anymore. Everybody's a contract worker. We are all fast food workers. What does that mean? 100 years ago and into the middle of the 20th century, most countries passed labor laws protecting workers, maximum hours, overtime pay, safety standards. By making everybody an independent contractor instead of an employee, corporations have done kind of an end run around labor protections for workers. So that's one thing. They're having to fight to win back the rights that workers fought for and won in the early 20th century. The next thing is that there's a real fight against the abuse of workers on the shop floor. Most low-wage workers are women, and so everywhere I went, they were fighting sexual violence in the workplace, sexual harassment, pregnancy discrimination. They were fighting for wage equity between male and female workers. So, there's that piece of it that to a large degree, although by no means exclusively, this has been a women's movement. And, finally, there's a real race to the bottom. What global capitalism means is that, for example, workers in Cambodia told me they were constantly threatened with the factories just picking up and leaving and moving to Bangladesh, right? They said employers would say, if you insist on higher wages, we'll just, close up shop and move someplace else where it's cheaper. And interestingly, now that Bangladeshi workers have been organizing so effectively since 2010, and they've raised their wages by many times, and they've been able to get hundreds of global corporations to agree to something called the Bangladesh Fire and Safety Accord, which mandates factory safety inspections and mandates that the global brands actually make repairs on the factories where they make their clothing. Since that time, we've gotten, this expansion even further. And so, there've been recent reports on how Ethiopia has become, the new fast fashion engine, because there are not the kinds of labor protections there that there are other places, but they're organizing there too. And finally, the one other thing that's really unites workers worldwide is they work for the same corporations. So, many of these workers, garment workers around the world are all making clothes for H&M, for Walmart, for Gap, for Zara. And, as far as fast food workers, McDonald's is the second largest private employer in the world. Walmart is the first, right? And so they've begun to organize together with workers who work for the same global corporations, because they realize that the only way to make a difference, to be felt, when you protest against such global behemoths, is to organize transnationally, and that's exactly what they've been doing.
Interesting. And of course, the thread that holds this together in your book is the impact of global capitalism. What did you learn that you didn't already know about global capitalism in writing this book?
Well, one of the things that really struck me is, I've been politically observant all my life, and I'm a political historian. It's what I do for a living. And yet I was really struck by the extent to which these changes took place in my adult life, and I missed them, right? I did not see it. And so I think one of the things that really struck me is that we've had the emergence of these global corporations and global supply chains that are so complicated that one of the first things workers have to do when they organize is figure out who they're working for, because they know they're not really working for the farmer in whose fields they labor, or even the garment factory owner in whose shop they make hundreds of shirts or pairs of sneakers or jeans in a day. Who they're really working for are the global brands, and the global brands intentionally make their supply chains complicated so that it's really difficult to trace who has the real power in these global supply chains. That's intentional, and also so they have plausible deniability. So Kalpana Akhtar, who's the leader of the Bangladesh garment workers movement, has talked about having to go in after factory fires in Dhaka and literally put her fingers in the still hot rubble and find invoices and labels so that she can then go to a Walmart or a Children's Place in the United States and say, you were there, because these corporations deny it. Of course they deny it. They don't want to have to pay reparations. They don't want to be sued. And so that's been, for me, really a surprise, is how much this process has been about making the invisible visible. For hotels, it's the same thing, right? We think of all these global hotel chains as being run, by one corporation, but, in fact, hotel chains have become this site for equity investment firms. Capital goes in and out, and the people who really run them are these hotel management firms. And, the people who clean hotel rooms are maybe the most invisible of all workers, right? We all imagine, as organizer Massimo Frattini in Geneva said to me, we all imagine that we leave the hotel room and a ferry comes in and makes it beautiful again by the time we come back that evening. Of course, it's real people. It's very, very hard on people's bodies. And so they've really worked to make themselves visible, and including some very creative kinds of protests. For example, a bed-making demonstration in Harvard Square when the workers of the Doubletree Harvard Square were trying to organize, and they wanted to get, people in the college to pay attention to them. They had to come out of the rooms, out of the hotels, into the street, and literally help people try to make beds the way they have to make, 20 30 beds a day so that people could see how punishing it is on their bodies. So I think this making the invisible visible has been really important. The field workers who pick tomatoes are currently fasting in front of the United Nations in New York because, they're trying to bring attention to sexual harassment and sexual violence in the fields. So again and again, these low-wage workers have had to fight their own invisibility, and that is really surprising and moving to me.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Annelise Orleck, professor of history at Dartmouth College and author of We Are All Fast Food Workers Now, the Global Uprising Against Poverty Wages. Annelise, another link you find across the globe is that of resistance. You touched on a little bit of it right there. You write about small successes that can be models for change. So what are some of those small successes that we need to know about?
Well, there are three things going on right now that I think are really important. The first is that out of the Los Angeles Alliance for a New Economy, which is one of the most creative progressive think tanks in the country, came a new organization called Jobs to Move America. And the idea was that you can take advantage of procurement budgets that cities have because cities spend a lot of money on things like mass transport, buses, trains, trucks. And so this organization has forged agreements with Los Angeles, New York, and Chicago, and in so doing have brought unionized heavy manufacturing back to those cities. And what they were able to negotiate is that the cities would agree, the city departments of transportation would agree to enforce in the contract bids, to give the contract bids to companies that agreed to A, make a sizable percentage, produce a sizable percentage of the trains, buses, trucks, in the city or right near the city, B, that they would be produced in an environmentally sensitive way and would be environmentally cutting-edge vehicles, and third, that they would be union jobs, and fourth, and that the unions would train workers for those jobs. Fourth, the people who would be trained would often be people who had really big obstacles in the way of their employment. So, women of color, former vets, former cons, people who have a really hard time finding work. And so it's very exciting. You've got trains being made on the south side of Chicago again. You've got really depressed areas outside of LA where electric trucks are being made. And they're being made through these kinds of contracts. So that's one model that I think is really important because there was so much rhetoric in the 2016 campaign about bringing manufacturing jobs back to the United States, to cities in the U.S. This progressive organization in Los Angeles is doing it, and they're doing it in really positive, environmentally friendly ways, gender equitable ways. I think that's a very exciting model. Here are a couple of others. The Villa Altagracia project makes logo wear clothing for 800 colleges and universities in the United States. This was a town in the Dominican Republic where there were these garment factories owned by foreign capital, in that case, Korean, I believe. And the workers had been trying to unionize for years, and they traveled to the United States. They made common cause with United Students Against Sweatshops, and consumers supported them, and eventually they were allowed to organize, to unionize. But then, as so often has happened in this new system, global capital fled, and the factory shut down, the town withered. Well, this guy, Phil Knight of Knight's Apparel, which makes uniforms for the National Hockey League, had a lot of tragedies in his family, and he said it made him come up and think about himself and what he is doing with his life besides making money. And he decided to open up a test project called the Villa Altagracia Project. And these are factories, garment factories with union jobs. Workers have health care. They're now people who are living in huts are living in houses with running water and electricity. Their kids get help trying to go to college. And this corporate, this responsible corporation is now, they partnered with United Students Against Sweatshops on these various campuses, and they partnered with Barnes & Noble, which runs a lot of campus bookstores, to create this label. right? So that when students go in and buy logo wear for these 800 colleges, they know that it's being made in a humane way by union workers, under safe conditions. And so I think Villa Altagracia is really an example of something that could be scaled up, right? If a relatively small clothing manufacturer could make a profit doing it, and they've just started to make a profit, they had to go a few years without, then I think this is really a model that can be scaled up. And then I think another success is there are a couple of different kinds. One of these producers cooperatives all over the country and the world. I visited some grape co-ops in South Africa, where people are growing grapes in the townships. And I think for berries, there's a really interesting farm in California called the Swanton Berry Farm, which is both unionized and organic. And they are part of a project that tries to bring union organic grown produce for sale in poor districts of their state, right, for sale for affordable rates. Workers are paid in part in shares of the company so that when they leave, they'll be able to retire. As a result, they stay on these berry farms for a really long time. And, it's one of the most stable workforces in agriculture. And so I think there are a lot of these kind of small successes that I think we need to look at. There are some zero-waste garment companies because fashion is a very dirty industry. There's a whole lot of going on that I think people should know about. And the final thing, maybe the biggest, is something called worker-led social responsibility codes. A lot of corporations have corporate social responsibility codes. They're worth only so much. But these worker-led codes that were pioneered by the Coalition of Immokalee Workers in Florida, and that have come to turn the Florida tomato fields from the worst agricultural workplaces in the country to the very best, is now being used by Vermont dairy workers. They just got Ben & Jerry's to sign on. And what it is the big buyer at the top of the supply chain, Ben & Jerry's or Taco Bell, who buys the most tomatoes, or H&M, who buys the most clothes, they agree that they will pay a little bit more from their suppliers for a premium product, that this extra money will also help to pay for outside safety inspections, and to negotiate grievances around sexual assault and violence, and to fight slavery, labor slavery in these workplaces. This, to me, is one of the most promising new strategies, and I think it's taking over and is one way that we're going to see, really different kinds of conditions and wages around the world.
Well, and those are all of those are wonderful examples. And the one thing I think is really important to point out is that you just gave examples of both small companies and large corporations that can make this happen. So I think that's a very, very positive sign indeed. As we listen to Donald Trump, Annelise, talk about tearing up trade deals and imposing tariffs, what does that mean for low-wage workers?
I think that there is no question that trade agreements like NAFTA and the Trans-Pacific Partnership had devastating effects on low-wage workers. I mean, what NAFTA did to small farmers in Mexico, as well as to American manufacturing workers, on the northern side of the border, was devastating. The thing is that the ways in which Donald Trump is going about, rethinking these trade deals has nothing to do with benefiting workers, right? These tariffs are, not thought through. They are, as is always the case with every economic policy that he comes up with, they're packaged to sound like they benefit workers when in fact they benefit corporations. I think if you really wanted to renegotiate NAFTA, and there are all kinds of reasons that you should, for environmental disasters, for the preservation of, the diversity of corn crops in a state like Oaxaca in Mexico, which have been devastated by GMO American corn and as it flooded into the country after NAFTA. If you want to renegotiate, then you've got to put the right kinds of stakeholders at the table. It's not something you can just rattle off at the end of a press, at the end of a meeting with manufacturers in answer to a quickly asked question by the press. So do we need a new trade regime? Absolutely. But I think we need one that is not geared toward destroying organized labor. We need a vision much more like the Franklin Roosevelt vision, in which you had labor, manufacturers, and consumers together at the table. I'm not saying that regime was perfect by any stretch, but that's the kind of vision and structure that you would need to renegotiate the trade deals that have devastated our world in the last 30, 40 years. And I do agree that there's been tremendous damage as a result of the World Trade Organization tribunals and the loan policies and project policies of the World Bank and the IMF. There's no question about that. But Donald Trump's tariffs are not the answer.
Right. Well, and it's also, fix it if it's broken. You don't necessarily have to throw out the entire thing. We're speaking with Annelise Orleck, professor of history at Dartmouth College, author most recently of We Are All Fast Food Workers Now, the Global Uprising Against Poverty Wages. Annelise, in another interview that you did on this book, you said this about the people you interviewed, quote, "They taught me that our inward-looking grief after the election of Donald Trump was a sign of our privilege, that we have to keep on fighting no matter what." Can you expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, I interviewed people who were, rising up and going into the streets, after Rodrigo Duterte was elected in the Philippines. The tremendous courage that it takes to go up against someone who, will shoot you as soon as look at you, really, really stunned me. And a lot of these are very young people, and one of them even said to me, we're too young. We can't afford to be afraid, right? This is, the movement is my life. She said, it's my music, it's my rhythm, and you can give me 1,000 reasons to leave it, and I will give you 1,000,000 why I have to stay on. I spoke to a 27-year-old activist and organizer of hotel and casino workers in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. And, going up against the Hun Sen regime in Cambodia is no joke either, as one of the longest-serving heads of state in the world, and also a man very willing to use violence to preserve his hold on power. He has, and he will. And she said, I know I could die. I know I could die in this struggle. She said, but that's okay. She said, it really is. I'm not just saying that. It's really okay if I could begin to bring change. And another organizer there said to me, after the Phnom Penh, we deserve a real democracy, and we will put our lives on the line for it. So I think that in meeting with these workers, I think in watching the workers, the 50,000 or more who went on strike in Baja California, the berry pickers, some of the poorest workers in the world, and who shut down that Trans-Pacific Highway from Baja into California, where the berries get shipped into the United States. Their bravery is tremendous. Again, they're beaten by police, shot at, and I think that their insistence on continuing the struggle is a real lesson to all of us here in the United States. And I think also that African American and Latinx organizers here in the United States also, especially undocumented workers and organizers, really also put in perspective our grief about the Trump election. I spoke to a 21-year-old organizer and activist, an African American guy in Las Vegas, Stretch Sanders, who said to me, this was the day after the election. He said, I'm scared. But he said, I'm not that scared. My brothers and sisters were already being shut down in the streets by police who should know better. My undocumented coworkers were already having knocks on the door, and families were already being broken up with parents taken with their kids, didn't know where they could find them. He said, this struggle's been going on a long time, and we can't stop now. So all of those people gave me hope, and they gave me strength, and I just try to live up to their courage.
So you just mentioned hope, and you have said in the past this book left you with a feeling of hope. Why hope?
Well, because they've achieved a tremendous amount in a very short time. So for 40 years, wages have been stagnating, and in fact, the real buying power of wages has been dropping precipitously. But since 2012, workers just in the United States, low-wage workers, have through through passing local and state legislation, through getting private corporations to agree as a result of their protests to raise the minimum wage, have won $61.5 billion in wage raises in just 4 years, right? That is 12 times the raise that Congress gave low-wage workers the last time it raised the federal minimum wage in 2007. It went into effect in 2009. You've had wage increases. Wages have increased by many times all over the world, in South Africa, in Cambodia, in Bangladesh, in Mexico. So wage increases are happening, and the only reason they're happening is because of this vast organizing and the kinds of protests and the savvy use of social media to publicize these protests that these workers have made. I think it's really important to say that protesting in this day and age is very different than protesting was even 10, 12 years ago, right? Was something between 10 and 15 million people protested around the world before the start of the first Gulf War. The second Gulf War, 2003. But there was very little coverage of it, right? Now people publicize their own events, right? I've watched people post videos of protests onto social media and messages and download images of protests in other parts of the world. It's a new era. So all of this gives me hope, but I think also there's something about the poverty wages that so many people are laboring under today that's soul crushing, and the kinds of disrespect. I think it's really crucial that many of the organizations that I looked at are called Respect. In the Philippines, the Fast Food Workers Union is called the RESPECT, Fast Food Workers Alliance. The Walmart Workers Organization in this country is called Organization United for Respect at Walmart, our Walmart. I saw this again and again everywhere I went, and I think workers are giving themselves that respect. They're earning that respect by winning concessions. Some of them are huge. I mean, the fact that they won this huge increase in the minimum wage in the states of New York and California, the two biggest labor markets in the U.S., that's huge. Is it enough? By no means. As LaFonza Butler, who's one of the union organizers who was the co-chair of the Living Wage campaign in L.A., said, nobody's going to Vegas on $15 an hour. It's $31,000 a year, even if you work full-time. But if you win it for yourself, you get a sense of respect and a sense of belief that you can bring change that fuels further action. And I think that's what gives me hope. There is change happening. It's not happening overnight. It's not enough yet, but change is happening, and it's potent and it's powerful. And even the Me Too movement, right? Long before we were hearing from Hollywood actresses, these workers around the world were campaigning for global UN resolutions and International Labor Organization conventions banning sexual violence in the workplace. That's amazing. And if they win it, it will change our world, and it will change individual lives in workplaces, from New York to Cape Town.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Great stuff. Annelise Orleck, professor of history at Dartmouth College and author of We Are All Fast Food Workers Now, The Global Uprising Against Poverty Wages. Annelise joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. Professor, we appreciate your time with us, and we do and hope that you can join us again soon.
I hope so. I'd love to talk with you more. Thank you so much for having me on.
You're quite welcome. Thank you. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, a roadmap for change, how trade deals can create jobs and protect workers' rights. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
We Americans believe that everyone has a right to their day in court, right? But what if the court is turned into a loony bin, making a mockery of justice? Welcome to the federal immigration courts that are struggling to deal with the insanity of Trump's imperious zero-tolerance decree that all Latino asylum seekers will be jailed and prosecuted as criminals. How insane is it? Toddlers, separated from their parents by Trump's border guards, are being put on trial for entering the U.S. illegally. We were representing a 3-year-old in court, said a dismayed defender of a migrant kiddo, and the child in the middle of the hearing started climbing up on the table. It really highlighted the absurdity of what we're doing with kids. Not just doing with them, but to them. Fleeing unimaginable trauma in their home country, then suffering the pain of being torn away from their parents inside our border. The expectation that these little ones can mount a legal defense has rightly been labeled unconscionable and grossly inappropriate by experts. But I would add, inexpertly, that it is insane and evil. Here's a bit of Trumpian evil for you. Johan, a 1-year-old Honduran boy taken from his amnesty-seeking father by border agents, was hauled into federal immigration court in July. A 1-year-old. As an AP reporter wrote, the baby briefly played with a ball, drank from a bottle, then cried hysterically. The law doesn't even require that children have a lawyer to represent them. The judge said he was too embarrassed to try explaining this judicial proceeding to anyone. I don't know who you would explain it to unless you think that a 1-year-old could learn immigration law, the judge said in exasperation. This is Jim Hightower saying, maybe he could try explaining it to the U.S. president who has foisted this lunacy on us. It's a case of the inmates having taken charge of the insane asylum.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. A new president in Mexico brings fresh uncertainty to the future of NAFTA. In an encore interview, Communications Workers of America's Dan Maurer says trade policy under NAFTA benefits multinational corporations at the expense of American workers and calls for a new framework that puts workers' rights first. And we say hello to Dan Maurer, legislative representative for the Communications Workers of America, and serves as a liaison on the U.S. Trade Representatives Labor Advisory Committee. He previously served as legislative director for former Congressman George Miller. Dan Maurer, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Glad to be here.
And our pleasure to have you with us as well. You know, the president wants to quit or substantially change the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. Is that something you welcome?
Yeah, to be quite frank, the way we view it is that our trade policy, including NAFTA, has been built not to benefit American workers or workers elsewhere, but instead to benefit the interests of multinational corporations. And that's reflects how the process has gone. A lot of times these negotiations have been very secretive, and corporate insiders have had special access, and no surprise, the people with special access have gotten deals written to their benefit. What we've seen is lost jobs and lower wages as a result. So we think that it needs really a substantial rewrite to actually put the interests of workers and communities in the environment first. Whether we'll actually see that is still tough to know from my end. As you've seen, the president has not been very friendly to workers or communities or the environment in areas from healthcare to taxes to labor law to Wall Street reform and everything in between. So we hope that we do really see an effort at a rewrite that puts working families first, but we still, I think the ball remains out a little bit on that question.
Mm-hmm. Now, you had mentioned job creation or job losses. I was under the impression that NAFTA has actually created more jobs than have been lost. Is that inaccurate?
I think that is inaccurate. Yeah, I think this is a common misconception that gets pushed by people, by the same interests who like the status quo. And so they don't want to see changes that would really fix things. If you look at what we've seen about 900,000 workers have gotten what's called trade adjustment assistance benefits. That's the benefits you get from the government if your job's shipped overseas. And those 900,000 are due to NAFTA alone. We think the number is actually a lot bigger than that because a lot of workers, like call center workers, for much of the time in that program have not been eligible. And other workers may not know that they're eligible, or they may simply not be able to show. If you're trying to deal with getting your life together after your job's been shipped away, you may not have the wherewithal to figure out what exactly happened to it. At the same time, we've seen a dramatic expansion in our trade deficit with Mexico in specific. We had a pretty even trade balance, and now we have a trade deficit of almost $60 billion per year with Mexico. That's largely just because companies have found that in Mexico workers are denied rights. They have very low wages, very few protections, and so they realize that if they move jobs there, they can increase their profits by exploiting Mexican workers. And so we've seen this effect all throughout the economy. And I think, certainly we have to have trade with the world, right? We can't, including with Mexico, including with Canada, but we need to have it if we want to create jobs, we need to do it in a way that is structured to create jobs and to benefit workers.
Mm-hmm. Do you look at NAFTA, which, so now NAFTA is about 25 years old, give or take.
Right.
Has it affected how has that affected the ability of U.S. unions to organize? Has it hurt them drastically?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really interesting question that far too often gets overlooked because the job losses themselves are very important, but we also need to see what happens to other workers, right? And we see this at CWA very often. Increasingly our members, whether they be in manufacturing or at call centers or elsewhere, their jobs can be done anywhere. And when we're negotiating, where we're trying to get a new contract, if we're trying to get better wages or we're trying to get better benefits and pensions and health care, at some point companies say, well, you know what, if you want all of that, then what we're going to do is we're going to move jobs to a place where we can exploit workers a lot better, like Mexico. And NAFTA has really facilitated that, and I think that's actually, we've seen that in a systematic way. There was a really interesting study out of Cornell University that found that threats to send jobs overseas in the face of union organizing drives tripled after NAFTA went into effect, which makes some sense because NAFTA greases the skids for companies to move jobs to lower wage countries. And so when we get pitted against workers in other countries, that makes it very hard for unions to organize and bargain and create better benefits. Even though, what we know is those workers are not our enemy, right? It's the companies are trying to pit us against one another, but they've been very successful at doing it, and you see that in the drop in the rates of unionization and in the wage stagnation you've seen throughout the economy.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Dan Maurer, legislative representative for the Communications Workers of America, and also serves as a liaison on the U.S. Trade Representatives Labor Advisory Committee. So 25 years ago, NAFTA was a pretty well-intended trade deal, Dan, was it not? But how much has technology affected NAFTA and kind of all of a sudden made it, not such a great thing?
I think I think in the concept of trying to work together with Mexico and Canada, that conceptually is a really great thing. I think I think the rules of the road are really important, because if you set the rules wrong, you're not going to get a good result. But on technology, and I think that's part of the problem with NAFTA. But on technology, and in particular, you see the automation and offshoring actually go hand in hand. People often argue about, well, did you lose jobs due to automation? Did you lose jobs due to offshoring? And we know that the real answer is both. We see huge trade deficits of hundreds of billions of dollars a year. That's not a direct result of automation. That can't be, right. So that offshoring, we know, plays a role. At the same time, we know that in a lot of factories, for example, you can have just a few workers doing the work that maybe 20 workers would have been doing 20 years ago. But one thing that we see that's really important that ties all this together is that when you have this threat of companies being either themselves threatening to offshore jobs to countries with low wages, or facing competition from companies that do that, they need to cut costs. And so it encourages automation, and as technology has picked up, you end up seeing that these threats of automation and offshoring are oftentimes end up having a sort of symbiotic relationship, where the two things are not. It's not a question of did automation cause your problems or did a bad trade deal cause your problems, but often the two really worked hand in hand to take away bargaining power from workers.
And something else, what about the environmental and health effects of NAFTA in Central America?
Yeah, that's actually something that is really an underrated aspect of it. We see NAFTA sets up these special tribunals that allow companies to challenge laws that they don't like. In practice, those are often environmental or public health laws, and sometimes labor laws as well. And that's one of the main points I was making in terms of NAFTA being set up to benefit the interests of multinational corporations, not workers. And we've seen that there's been a lot of research showing that these tribunals create a chilling effect on companies wanting to create public interest laws. They also have been used many times throughout Central America to, especially by mining companies that want to create mines that are going to have really damaging effects on the water supplies and clean water, and so that's a really big problem. Because if you can't set up good rules to protect clean water, you're going to see a lot of direct impacts. The other thing is that NAFTA has had really, really weak environmental standards. And what that means is that you get a race to the bottom, not just in terms of worker rights, but also in terms of environmental standards. So there's a lot of goods where we've in the U.S., for example, we've set better standards on lead in a lot of processes and products, and Mexico's standards are about only 1/10 as good, so you can have 10 times as much lead. And as you see some of these industries move to Mexico, you see high lead contamination, and you see really negative impacts on the public health of kids there, for the same reason that you see problems with lead in Flint and other communities across our country, even with our somewhat better standards. So it's I think we're our interests, the interests of workers, go hand in hand with the interests of people who care about the environment as far as NAFTA is concerned.
Yeah. Now, in general, you, of course, advocate for workers' rights to be as globalized as is the capital that moves across borders. But how would that work or even be enforced?
Absolutely. That's something that has really arisen more recently as a major point, as we've seen how companies have used trade agreements to pit workers in one country against another. What we see in NAFTA, for example, is that companies have the same rights to move if they open up a factory in Canada, the U.S., or in Mexico. You don't have much in the way of labor standards at all, but to the extent you do have labor standards in other trade deals, they tend to only be concerned with just how are labor standards doing in this country? They're doing okay. Okay, how are labor standards doing in another country? But you don't have rights guaranteed for workers to organize across companies, across countries. At CWA, we represent workers at AT&T, for example. AT&T has numerous call centers opened up in Mexico, some of them serving the U.S. Our vision is that we should be able to work with the few independent unions in Mexico that do represent workers' interests, and we should be able to bargain together to advance our interests with AT&T. I think you can write those guarantees right into the trade agreement. You can say that if you have operations in both countries as a company, you have to respect the rights of workers to bargain together. And we've seen that in practice happen at times, but there's no guarantee by law that CWA works very closely with Las Telefonistas, which is one of the few independent unions in Mexico. The United Steelworkers, one of America's other great unions, works very closely with Los Mineros, one of the other few independent unions. But we don't have legal protections for those relationships, so that really is why we think that those should be guaranteed in a fully enforceable way in a new NAFTA.
Now, globalization, Dan, is not something that can nor should be stopped. But do we need laws and treaties to make it fairer for workers, or perhaps a new template of technological, educational, or economic change?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head with that question. Globalization is here to stay, and done right, it can be a benefit and bring people together and help raise wages and create jobs all over the world if we take advantage of all of our different strengths and work with people across countries. But I think it's been shown that the current model hasn't worked, and it's had really bad economic effects, and it's also had bad political effects here in the U.S. as well as elsewhere. So I think what we need to do is come up with a new framework that puts the interests of workers first in trade agreements. And then when we do that, we can see that will benefit workers here in the U.S. and here and throughout the world. But until we do that, we're going to keep on seeing these threats of, if the question is pitted of the status quo or just trying to cut off globalization altogether, I think you're going to see this continued interest in cutting off globalization altogether, which is why we really need some real strong laws and protections that protect the interests of workers.
Okay. Dan Maurer, legislative representative for the Communications Workers of America, and serves as a liaison on the U.S. Trade Representatives Labor Advisory Committee, our guest today on americasdemocrats.org. Dan, we appreciate your time with us, and we do look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Great. Thanks for having me.
You're quite welcome, and thanks for being with us. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with Rebecca Leber of Mother Jones about the EPA post-Scott Pruitt and why we should expect more of the same.
As a friend of Bill for the entire hour, our Democratic strategist Rebecca Leber covers environmental issues, particularly in politics in general, for Mother Jones. Hi, Rebecca. Nice to see you.
Hi.
So the big day yesterday, Joel and everybody else at EPA, Andrew
Wheeler.
Andrew Wheeler, who was deputy to Scott Pruitt, has taken over, and he summoned all the employees at EPA yesterday to say, okay, here's who I am, and here's what I want to do here at the agency. And how did you get into this meeting?
You
snuck in? I can't believe you invited the media.
Yeah, normally I'm not invited to the EPA, but it seems like they're trying to turn over a new leaf, at least temporarily, for this new administrator. I was getting deja vu because I was at the EPA on Pruitt's first day, where he delivered a very similar address to EPA employees. And at the time, people didn't quite know what to expect from him. I mean, they had heard all the news reports, but there was still some hope that things might not be as bad as predicted. And I think the mood was certainly different yesterday, because now we have a year and a half of the Trump administration and attempts at steep budget cuts and demoralized staffers. And Wheeler came in with a conciliatory tone, but he, at the same time, still struck the similar conservative talking points that we heard from Pruitt, that basically suggests he will continue what Pruitt started.
So here is Mr. Wheeler yesterday, Ray, if we have that clip, where he's saying he got a call from the president last week.
When President Trump called me last week and asked me to take the lead, he asked me to focus on three key areas. He said, clean up the air, clean up the water, and provide regulatory relief. I think we can do all three of those things at the same time.
Now, there seems to be an internal contradiction to me. I mean, yeah, clean up the air, clean up the water, but get rid of all the regulations, Joel, right? That would, in fact, result in cleaner air and cleaner water.
Kind of feels like it's a Trump administration mantra, right? It's like, just wish it to be true, but don't actually do the things you have to do to actually, get the results that you're claiming that you want, that there's no proof, by the way, that he actually cares about. Never once have I heard Donald Trump say anything about clean air and clean water. Not once.
Yeah. So what was the reaction yesterday were you able to talk to any of the employees?
Well, not in the same room. There were career staffers who filled this Rachel Carson room. That's what that room is called. Pruitt delivered the address in the same room. I think the morale at the EPA is possibly at historic lows, even worse than the Ann Gorsuch years, because at least in that case, the EPA administrator who came behind Gorsuch, who was famous for being very, very similar to Pruitt and condescending the agency, that there was hope that things would be turned around, and things are not in that environment now. And the EPA's faced at least a decade of budget cuts and other challenges. So while Wheeler did offer an olive branch saying, look, I did work for a coal company, that's not all I did. And he talked about how he worked on a bill about coal miner protections. So he certainly read his audience there. I'm not sure he's convinced people that he is truly on EPA staffers' side. We'll see if he does listen to experts.
A little reality check here. Right? In the last year and a half, Donald Trump and Scott Pruitt have overturned every single environmental regulation adopted under the Obama years that they were able to.
They've tried.
Right.
It's a long process, so they've begun the process.
They've begun the process.
Courts will have their say on that too.
Good point. But everything they've been able to do to undo, they have undone, or at least started the process for undoing it. None of that's going to change under Wheeler, right? They're not going to go back and reinstate any of those.
Yeah, so Senator James Inhofe was in the room yesterday. He's a staunch Wheeler ally. So that, if your listeners are familiar with Inhofe, which I'm sure they are, he's the Senate's biggest climate change denier. He's a very big ally.
And Scott Pruitt's mentor from Oklahoma.
So
Andrew Wheeler used to work for him.
Oklahoma Mafia.
No, absolutely.
I have a few theories on that. Some political interests and donors in the Trump administration who come from Oklahoma, also the evangelical circles. But so Wheeler does not represent a shift at all. The only difference between him and Pruitt is that Wheeler comes of Washington. He worked a very long time ago at the EPA. He worked for Senator Inhofe for years. He's possibly, the speculation is he might be better at navigating some of the ethical, the ethics that sunk Pruitt. At the same time, he's a former lobbyist, so he will have to walk this fine line with his former clients.
So he could be, in effect, Joel, more dangerous than Pruitt.
He could.
Because more effective.
Yeah, and so two things. Number one, I don't think we can disentangle Andrew Wheeler from what we've seen over the last year and a half, right? I mean, he was right there with Pruitt, probably helping him execute this. I think the question that should be posed is there anything that Scott Pruitt did that you disagree with? And have him actually call out and say what he would do differently in terms of policy, if anything, because I haven't seen any evidence that he would. So that's one. Secondly, just a question for you. Is there a plan for the president to nominate somebody else? Does he feel like Wheeler's his guy going forward? You know, because this is just an interim label for Mr. Wheeler at the moment. Is there a plan to make him the permanent administrator or no?
It's a great question. I think with all of the nominees that the Trump administration has to get through, especially before the midterms and a new Supreme Court nominee, this does not appear to be high on their list to nominate someone else. They have their Senate confirmed guy who is a big advocate for industry interests already there. So this could certainly carry out. Wheeler could be nominated permanently for the post. He already got through his Senate hearings. One thing, it almost kind of snuck through because this was happening right as the Pruitt scandals were blowing up, and it seemed more and more likely Pruitt would step down. Wheeler was confirmed by the Senate, even though Democrats, environmentalists called for that to be delayed because they wanted more scrutiny over his nomination given this new power.
By the way, just one little insight into Scott Pruitt's management style at the EPA. Last week, we had as a guest from the American Federation of Government Employees, or AFGE, I think his name is Nate James. He is the head of the union for EPA employees. So he's an EPA career veteran, the head of all the federal employees who are union members who work at EPA headquarters here in Washington, as well as around the country, but he's part of the headquarters here. And I asked him about his relationship with Scott Pruitt. He told us, I almost fell off my chair, if in 18 months, he had not only not met Scott Pruitt, not met him, not shaken his hand, he had never even seen him in the building.
He was in Oklahoma a lot, traveling the country. And the world.
Yeah, in the world. I was going to say, it was in Oklahoma. He was also over in Europe, living the high life.
Yeah.
I mean,
now, the idea that he may not have shaken hands or spoken to every single person who works in that building, because there are thousands of them, but still, the guy was the head of the employees. He had never even taken time to say, hey, maybe we ought to, just have coffee or something.
But this was like a launching point job for Scott Pruitt, right? I mean, all the reporting tells us that this was a part of him trying. I mean, didn't he try to make himself a candidate for Attorney General if Sessions were stepped down, et cetera?
He did float himself for Attorney General. There were also his allies floating him for that position.
Yeah, didn't he tell Trump to fire Jeff Sessions and make me Attorney General?
Yeah, I wouldn't. Those were the reports. I wouldn't put it past him. He. From the start, when I was covering him since his first day, he approached this job as a campaign job. He ran his press shop and the EPA as if it were a political operation, not a public agency. You saw that in the hostility to reporters and how Pruitt extensively would outreach to the most conservative press that would tell this positive story while shutting out other reporters. Typically, that's not how a government agency works or should work. And that's just one example of how he kind of treated the EPA as this launching pad. He also hired political operatives to do EPA policy. There were all these reports.
And to cover up his schedule and erase the things from his schedule.
Yeah, I mean, they knew people were watching, so it's amazing that what he thought he could get away with. He had people, there were people in his press shop who were looking through EPA grants, trying to find climate change. This is not how things are normally done. And he's widely expected, and it's possible he will still do this, run for office in Oklahoma.
There you go.
Down the road.
Come back to the Oklahoma.
He might. I haven't seen polls on him in Oklahoma these days, but he was very popular there. He has strong allies like Inhofe there. So I think there's a lot of cheer that his political career is dead, and it's not necessarily the case.
Mm-hmm. There were, the last time I checked, some 12 investigations of Pruitt for his ethical problems. What happens to those now? Do they just end, or do they continue? Is he still in hot water? Could be in hot.
So I've almost, it's been really hard to count these investigations because they kept ballooning. So the number might even have been higher than that, but
I thought 12 was high.
Yeah, but and no signs of going away. They actually do continue. It depends. So for EPA Inspector General investigations, which are the bulk of these investigations he's under, I asked after he stepped down or announced he would step down, the IG office, well, what happens to those investigations? They confirmed to me these continue regardless. Many of these are audits of EPA policy. It doesn't necessarily mean Pruitt would be hauled back in for repercussions whenever they reach their conclusions. But they refer cases that do have possible criminal conduct to the Department of Justice. Democrats in Congress have asked for a criminal probe of Pruitt. Unclear what happens to that, but many of the investigations he's under do continue. So I guess we might be hearing more about Scott Pruitt.
So it may not be the end of the story, Joel.
It sure doesn't seem like it. And it's just, I think we can have a real discussion here about, is this the most corrupt member of the Trump administration, or has this been the low watermark for the Trump administration? I mean, this certainly seems like it, right? It seems like this was kind of rock bottom in terms of this president who claimed to want to drain the swamp, claimed to want to clean up Washington, and essentially doubled down on the swamp, doubled the size of the swamp with Scott Pruitt's EPA. I really wonder what history is going to tell us in terms of that.
Hardly alone of people around Donald Trump who have had ethical conflicts. If you're starting with Tom Price or Michael Flynn, I guess, or maybe Flynn was a different matter, but Tom Price for sure. You mentioned Ben Carson earlier, and
Zinke has had his own trouble,
and David Shulkin, and
Rick Perry has strangely been the one to lay low.
I know, it is strange.
Yeah,
and Pruitt probably worst of all, and yet lasted longer because I always figured that Donald Trump liked what he was doing at EPA, so
Pretty
he
much.
was willing to look the other way about all the condo story and the getting the favorite body lotion story.
But the reason why he was forced to step down wasn't because of the scandals, right? It was because he floated out the news about the Attorney General stuff that made him. That's what set the president off, right? That
was reported.
I've stopped trying to get inside Trump's head, but. Pruitt, he said the White House's line on Pruitt whenever asked, what are you doing about this, was, well, we like what he's doing.
Yeah.
He's been effective and whatnot.
On his last day, wasn't there like sort of like one parting shot of Pruitt that one more environmental regulation he killed on the very last day or some...
Right, he did. I happened to be taking off that day, so I wasn't covering it. Pruitt fortunately resigned on a Thursday, not when I was planning on vacation. But he did reverse an Obama era rule.
Yet again.
Right before he left. Many of the rules he's begun to reverse are just going to continue the process under Wheeler, and we're expecting soon another big regulation that just came. Will be announced at some point. It's at the White House for review. Is the replacement for Obama's Clean Power Plan? That's Obama's signature climate plan for reducing emissions at power plants, and the EPA has to do something to replace it because that is what's legally required. So that could very well be one of Wheeler's first big moves, is unveiling that whatever they're doing there, which would likely have to acknowledge climate change is real. So that it'll be interesting to watch that.
Now, Joel and I have been talking, we're talking in the last half hour about Brett Kavanaugh and the Supreme Court nominee. Some of these issues could end up in front of the court. What do we know about Kavanaugh and his environmental background, leanings, or whatever?
Well, he's
if anything.
Yeah, as in most issues, he's a reliable conservative vote on the court. A few key issues to watch, which I'm sure you've gotten into, is on Chevron deference, the precedent where the government or courts defer to agency expertise when they are ruling on a challenge, saying that the EPA didn't interpret the statute properly on carbon emissions or what have you. The courts generally, under this precedent, defer to the agencies. Kavanaugh, as well as Gorsuch, lean towards wanting to chip away at that precedent, which would mean under a future administration or under these challenges, these lawsuits over Trump rolling back Obama rules, that the court could be less likely to say, well, the agency knows what it's doing here. There's also...
so if I could just say, what I understand you're saying is like the scientists at the EPA, the court is saying, no, don't pay attention to those scientists at the EPA.
Yeah, right? And policymakers at the EPA. It's basically the courts would kind of take some of the power back from the agencies and have to pour over the science, deciding what the science says. These are not scientists who sit on the court. And the other key issue is just what he does about climate change regulations. He said climate change is real, but when on rules that he's issued opinions, he has said the agency doesn't have the authority from Congress. So that's a major issue as environmentalists and states try to force the Trump administration to do something about climate change. That's a huge legacy that Kavanaugh would have on the court, because these are our most critical years to address it. And he could say, well, the government doesn't have tools to do it.
Yeah, he does seem in several of his opinions to have that the government is overreaching, the government's going too far, agencies are going too far, you got to limit their powers, which is not a good sign in terms of upholding the EPA or even the Affordable Care Act.
You know, as I'm thinking about this, I'm reminded of my...
This could be one more plank for Democrats to go after. Sorry.
Absolutely. No, you're fine. My favorite quote about Brett Kavanaugh came from Dick Durbin. You may have heard this. Where a couple years ago, I think he was being nominated for the lower court, and Dick Durbin called him the Forrest Gump of Republican politics. Because essentially he's been there at every watershed moment over the last 20 years, right? And I'm sure you can go through the environmental regulations and you can kind of point those out. But if you go back to Whitewater, Bush v. Gore, a number of issues throughout the 2000s, Brett Kavanaugh has been essentially a fly in the ointment for progressives over the last 20 years. And so, for those who think that there should be like a languishing concern about his nomination, I mean, there's a lot there to be concerned about if you care about these progressive issues. And he's been at the tip of the spear on the other side for a long time.
Yeah. No,
yeah. An environmentalist called him Lord Voldemort. I think that
a great nickname.
That summarizes the environmental opinion of what this will do. Kennedy was the key fifth vote on a lot of environmental decisions. So, there's lots of names for him.
Yeah. I mean, I think one big mistake people would be making is to assume that Brett Kavanaugh is going to be the next Anthony Kennedy, because he's not. He and Gorsuch are both.
It's going to be the next Sam Alito.
Yeah, right. Right. Or the next Neil Gorsuch or whatever, who's already proven to be the second most conservative member of the bench, Clarence Thomas being the most, but even to the right of Scalia, Gorsuch so far. And that's the mold. Totally unrelated to Scott Pruitt or whatever. We can't go into the weekend without getting your thoughts on what can we expect from when Donald Trump one-on-one with Vladimir Putin on Monday in Helsinki.
You want to go first?
Oh, well, I guess I'll just plug. I'll plug a story I did on I think the overlooked Russia connection when we talk about all the Russia investigations. When Trump announced he would pull out from the Paris Climate Agreement, Putin said, "Don't worry, be happy." At a summit was his reaction. You could tell he was happy about this decision about the U.S. pulling out because it gave Russia a better ledge for negotiating global positions. So who knows if the Paris Agreement will come up.
Yeah, doing Putin's dirty work is what he's doing.
What stands out to me is that it's pretty obvious that the president thinks that he's playing this three-dimensional chess with Vladimir Putin where he's not criticizing him, but he's doing stuff that he won't like. And I think what's frustrating to me is it's clear that Putin is running circles around him. And I think the world can see it, not just us, not just here in progressive radio land, but the entire world can see it. And this president's going to be the last person to realize this is a war he's completely overmatched for. With a match of wits with this guy, he has no chance.
KGB wins again. Hey, Rebecca, great to see you. Thanks for coming in. Mother Jones, motherjones.com. And Joel, great to see you too. Thank you.
That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Dan Maurer, Annelise Orleck, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.